Hello class, I'm Bree and my fiction presentation is on Orientalism in French literature. So first off, before I get into the presentation, it's important to understand what Orientalism is. According to Leo Botstein, who is um, a PhD holder in musicology, um, he specifically studied French music and how French music has been influenced throughout a lot of time. And his definition of Orientalism, I thought, was very straightforward. In his definition is the term Orientalism does not refer to characteristics or ethnicities located in a massive geographical region that spread from North Africa to the Middle East all the way to Asia, termed indiscriminately in the 19th century Europe as the Orient. Rather, it refers to a European fascination and obsession with distant cultures based on a historic accumulation of preconceptions and stereotypes. These developed in the European imagination before the Crusades. They lasted for centuries with residues still visible in contemporary European and American representations of Islam in Asia. Their currency was enhanced by the experience of colonial and imperial expansion in the 18th and 19th centuries. I think his definition, at least to me, as someone who is an anthropology major and has a lot of experience with Orientalism, it's very straightforward. But to sum it up, Orientalism is a view that a lot of Westerners have towards Africa, especially North Africa, the Middle East, Asia, especially South Asia, that treats them as an other. And it comes off on the surface level as a fascination, as a fetishization, but in reality, it's not a fascination that's born from respect. Orientalism is a very specific type of racism, which is what we're getting into this slide, which is what is the problem with it. Again, it's a form of racism that, as with all forms of racism, leads to very real harm. Orientalism is what has inspired imperialism, especially in France in particular. French Orientalism really takes a lot of its roots from Napoleon I deciding that he wanted to expand into Egypt. Orientalism today is used to justify xenophobia, it's used to justify crimes, especially crimes against women of color, and it's important to note that it's completely fine to have a respectful fascination and desire to learn about any of the Eastern world, as however Orientalism is not a respectful fascination. So just some quick examples of Orientalism, so you can kind of get a better understanding of it. Disney's Aladdin is a great example because Disney's Aladdin, nobody really knows where it takes place because so many elements of it are an amalgamation of different elements from different countries and different regions and different cultures, and it was just all painted with such a broad stroke to show that they don't actually care to kind of understand the differences and depict the people in the movie in a more accurate light. Another example would be a lot of TikTok spiritual content that's been going around since the pandemic. A lot of these spiritual content creators end up misappropriating real dharmic faiths like Hinduism, Sikhism, or Buddhism, and misappropriating a religion is a form of Orientalism because it shows that you enjoy the aesthetics of this religion, but you don't actually care about how it's properly practiced or how the people who've been practicing this for their whole lives feel about someone just coming in and co-opting their symbolism. Paintings, there's a whole category of paintings during the Enlightenment and Romantic era that are just called Orientalist paintings. They all lean heavy into the stereotypes of what Asia and the Middle East and North Africa were like. All of the women in these paintings are painted almost half naked. There's snake charmers, there's bazaars everywhere, and it's not really a reflection of the reality of life in these places. They're just made to uphold the perceived aesthetic of the quote-unquote Orient. And of course, literature, which is what we'll be analyzing today, specifically French literature. So it's important to note that Orientalism is a very interesting form of bigotry because it's not just coming solely from a place of racism, it's also coming from a place of sexism. The Orient was, according to Edward Said, who is a Palestinian author, he is the it guy when it comes to speaking about Orientalism and how it shows up throughout history. This is a very interesting quote that I found from him, and it's, "The Orient was viewed as something inviting French interest, penetration, insemination. French scholars, administrators, geographers, and commercial agents poured out their exuberant activity onto the fairly supine feminine Orient." So we already know that France, while today they might be ahead of us in terms of misogyny and women's rights, it was not always that way. Especially, we still, everyone thinks of the French Revolution. The first person that comes to your mind is Marie Antoinette, and how she's somewhat blamed for the cause of the revolution, while her husband, who had significantly more power than her at the time, just gets brushed off scot-free, in my opinion. Nobody really talks about King Louis as much as they do Marie. And naturally, especially in Orientalism in the 1800s, this definitely played a role, which we can see in a couple of works. These two works that I'm gonna Crabulon de l'Sofa and Diderot's Les Bijoux Indiscrets. They're both novels, and they were both actually very fun reads, but a little bit uncomfortable. Just a warning, this PowerPoint does go into the topic of sex. So, Le Sofa is a novel that's structured the same way many of the stories in Arabian Nights are. The main character is also the narrator, and it just so happens that the main character is a former courtesan who was cursed by Brahma to be reincarnated as couches until two virgins consummate their relationship on him. The narrator tells the story about 7 couples that he witnessed before being freed from, in quotations, virtuous love. Les Bijoux Indiscrets is a story about the Sultan of Congo suspecting his mistress of infidelity. So a genie gives him a ring that can make women's parts talk about their experiences if he puts on the ring and points the ring to their parts. The ring also has the ability to make him invisible, so he hides in his mistress's boudoir to see what she's up to. Both stories have some interesting points in common, as we mentioned earlier. They are sexist stories. All of the women in these stories are Oriental women, and they're not just promiscuous women, but voyeuresque women. They're depicted as being significantly attached to sex and having no other personality beyond that. Most of the characters that do show a semblance of personality tend to be the men, and even if there is an inkling of personality with some of the female characters, it gets brushed off as, well, she expresses this personality through sex. Um, incredibly, if you are familiar with any of world history, any Middle Eastern, South Asian culture, religion, whatever it may be, you already know that a lot of what I just said about those stories sound very strange, which it is. Congo did not have sultans, nor was it a place where genies, or rather jinn, were talked about. Brahma doesn't curse souls, nor is Brahma from Arabic religion. Brahma is just the main, I don't want to say the main god, because that's technically also incorrect, but a main figurehead god in Hinduism. But in the 18th century, to a lot of Europeans, it was just all the same mumbo jumbo. There wasn't a motivation to properly portray these people as accurately as possible, because a lot of these stories were made with the goal and intention of being of kind of being satirical, and in other ways upholding the status quo of already existing racism and sexism at the time, which is very important to note that both of these stories are supposed to be political allegories. Well, more so gossip allegories for actual Parisians and bourgeoisie at the time. So Le Sofa has the 7 couples that I mentioned. All 14 people of those couples were all allegories for actual people. It just so happens that the mistress in Les Bijoux Indiscrètes is actually an allegory for Madame Pompadour. So France has a very big attachment to satire. As we've seen in the past 2 stories, they're supposed to be satirical. And I think that there's a big history of French satire that intersects almost every aspect of written word. There's poetical satire, there's political satire, to the point where being able to, the freedom of speech, the ability to make some edgy and sometimes abrasive jokes are taken very seriously, because this is a big part of the type of humor that is enjoyed by some French folks. I don't want to paint this with a broad brush, but throughout my readings of French literature, there's always been this somewhat comedic, somewhat bad attitude that kind of goes hand in hand. It's a very cynical sense of humor. One of my favorite French short stories is called Dimanche, and it's about a mother watching her daughter make the same mistakes as her, and the mother just has this attitude of, well, she's gonna learn her lesson eventually, and it's sad, but it's also portrayed as a little bit funny, which I think I've seen a lot of, because most of my experience with French comics are political comics, and a lot of these stories that I just mentioned, Le Sofa and Les Bijoux Indiscrètes, it did have this sense of cynicism hand in hand with its satire. And on the topic of French attitudes, there's a common phrase for the attitude that a lot of Parisians have that very much encapsulate what I have tried to explain, and that phrase is called the Paris Spleen. The Paris Spleen also happens to be a poem by Charles Baudelaire, and we can also find Orientalism not just in novels, not just in political cartoons, even though we're not going to get into political cartoons today. But Orientalism very much existed in the poetry of Victor Hugo and Charles Baudelaire, two very important and wonderful French writers and poets. So Les Gines by Hugo. Just as a note, these lines and stanzas are not taken, they don't directly follow each other, and also they've been translated, so they're not in the original French. Reading them in the original French is something I recommend you do if you do have the time. They're still really fun poems to read, and if you are practicing French, it'll help you, even if you should read them with some critical gaze, if that makes sense. So Les Gines by Hugo, he alludes to a lot of what seems to be Arabic Muslim imagery. For example, as shown here, instead of saying my God or Jesus, he says Prophet, which is a direct, tie to Prophet Muhammad. And it especially points to how much the goal, well, not necessarily, even if it wasn't the goal, it was a subconscious effort that there was to continue to other people of different faiths and of different cultures, because had Hugo wrote my God here, it would make a lot more sense than saying prophet if we're being realistic. But again, the goal isn't to make sense or to be accurate, it's to portray a stereotype. And Le Serpent qui danse by Baudelaire, there's actually a really great quote from a graduate student named Sanchari Chowdhury that I want to read to you, that I think again encapsulates what we discussed earlier, which is the body of the Oriental female is portrayed as mysterious, esoteric, and barbaric in order to make Europe a rational historical domain. This would in turn establish superiority over the East through comparison. The other is what is not innate to European civilization. It is not rational, civilized, or socialized. It exhibits madness and greed through its nightmares, physical expressions, and chaotic passion. A lot of Orientalist logic is used especially against women of color. They are fetishized and then kind of abandoned in terms of they are worth a physical gaze, but never to be seen as a human being. They're meant to kind of embody this sense of poetry, but then when it's time to treat them as people, that is out of the question. Which again, the sexism is a big part of Orientalism as a whole. So unfortunately, that is it. Even though I critiqued Hugo's and Baudelaire's work, I think exploring the other works that they've done should be something that you invest in as someone learning about Francophone culture, because they're authors and poets with such a long legacy, but also it's important to keep in mind that they are from a different time and thus express opinions that are not great. um, Orientalism still very much exists today. It doesn't look like this anymore. Sometimes it does. There are still people who are writing poems and novels and depicting people of color in an inaccurate and kind of disrespectful way. But simultaneously, for every person doing that, like there's more people who are writing books and poems that do depict people of color respectfully. So it isn't the kind of main force of media that we see that depicts Orientalism. Honestly and truly, most of the Orientalism that you're gonna find in 2023 is probably gonna be on TikTok or something. But again, while exploring French literature, I think Orientalism is a good topic to kind of familiarize yourself with, because France has such a big tie towards North Africa, some parts of the Middle East. It's very normal that cultures have affected each other throughout time, and naturally, these attitudes will sometimes show up in literature, and they, by not being aware of them, we make ourselves susceptible to them. So, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed.